Scott Morrison, welcome to the program.
G'day, Graham.
Now, look, I want to start off with the GST because obviously it's the big headline out of today's speech at the press club. Now, it's only about 2 weeks, I can't be exact, but roughly 2 weeks ago you were talking it up. Today it's gone, finished, dead, buried, cremated, whatever other expression you want to use. What happened in the 2 weeks to make you change your mind and to make the government walk away?
Well, the government kept this option alive so we can examine it and we could work it through. I mean, if it was a political decision, I mean, the politics of this were well known last October. So what we decided to do was to do the work. The work came in. We considered all the implementation issues, particularly the escalating cost of compensation. And at the end of the day, the numbers just didn't stack up. And so we decided for policy reasons not to pursue it. If we did it on politics, we would have done it months ago.
Yeah, I noticed that you said today that there's 16 billion would have been necessary in compensation for those not so well off. The last figure I saw in this was about 9. How did it get to 16?
Well, that's what it could get to. I mean, as John Howard learned after the GST election back in 1998, what he took to the election wasn't what was passed through the parliament. So you had to be conscious of the risks. I mean, it's not unlike, assessing an investment proposal. It will achieve a certain rate of return if the development approvals come on time and the wage rates stay where they are and interest rates do particular things. Now, if those variables move around, well, it's obviously going to impact on the viability of what you're doing. And that's the sort of candid and assessment that we put in place, and we made a call.
Well, are you happy with the call? Because now your options are extremely limited, aren't they? I mean, you can't with those top 2 tax rates and the company tax rate anything very serious now.
Well, you certainly don't have the scope and scale you had if you were playing with $30 billion a year to actually apply to personal income tax cuts. I mean, that's just an obvious statement. And that's why we really had to work through that threshold question of whether the tax mix switch, which could have made that available, was possible and implementable and worth it. Now, we worked out that it wasn't, that we shouldn't do it, not that we wouldn't do it, that we shouldn't do it, and that's why we made the decision. And that obviously then rescopes and rescales what you have available to you for sort of more mini tax mix switch options that you'd have available. But our point is, if we're going to change any other taxes in any other areas, the revenue you raise from that would be delivered towards lowering taxes in the areas we've identified as priorities, and that's personal income tax and company tax.
Well, when you look at company tax, we are so uncompetitive with Asia. How are we going to keep the rate where it is? Don't we need to drop it substantially? I don't mean by a cent or two, I mean by like 5 cents, 6 cents, something serious. Why can't we do that?
Well, we've already dropped the rate to 28.5 for small businesses, as you'd be aware in the last budget. And the thing about company tax is it isn't just the morning after effect of what you do on company tax. It's what the plan is over 5 or 10 years. Now, this is what they've done in the UK, and when you're considering an investment from overseas or wherever, the company tax will be relevant not just now, but what it is down the track. Now, we'll continue to work through those issues. We've made no secret of the fact that we would like to see company tax rates lower because it does make us more competitive and it's good for jobs and growth. But you have to fund them. You have to fund them, and to ask Australian householders to pay more tax in order to fund company tax cuts, well, I think the difficulties with that are fairly obvious to any observer, and we have to find ways to be able to support those changes, and we're certainly on the hunt to do just that.
Yeah, look, that all sounds pretty reasonable, but you are in fact going to tax ordinary households more, aren't you now? Because you can't do much about thresholds and tax rates. Aren't you now going to be very, very, very reliant on that second top rate and people falling into it in bracket creep over the next few years? That's where government revenue is going to come in, isn't it?
Well, that is exactly right, and that's what the Treasury modelled, and they said that the growing rates of average taxes for people who earn for a living and pay taxes on those earnings is rising, and that is holding the economy back. It's actually going to, it's like a sheet anchor, and the extra spending you get from those higher taxes doesn't make up for it. And so the tax and spend approach, which our opponents favour, well, that's not a plan for jobs and growth. So it remains our task going forward to try and prevent those people on middle incomes moving into higher tax brackets, and that remains an objective, and that's what we're working towards as we prepare the budget.
It remains an objective, but if you don't do much about it, that $80,000 threshold, hundreds of thousands of workers are going to hit that over the next 3 years, aren't they?
Well, that's right, and that's why we're focused on it. And we're the only ones in this debate who have expressed any interest or are applying themselves to ensure that doesn't happen. What the Labor Party are proposing is, you know, Graham, is that, yes, they've suggested increasing lots and lots of taxes in lots of areas. 8 billion worth, in fact, but they're not using any of that to reduce taxes. They're using all of it for higher spending. Well, that's not our approach.
Yeah, but it's getting harder for you to say that, isn't it? I mean, when you look at the record, your government's been in
power
not hard
for
at all. Yes, it is. You've been in power for 2.5 years, not 2 minutes, not 2 months, not 2 weeks, 2.5 years. Debt's up, deficit's up. They're not great results for the party that got in, claiming that we had a crisis in both.
Well, let me give you the facts. Over $80 billion in savings, and that has funded just over $70 billion in additional spending. So we have ensured that any new spending that the government has put in place has been funded by savings in the budget. We haven't put that on top of the budget. We've actually made sure the budget has watched its face for the last 2.5 years. If we hadn't done that, then the situation would be far worse than it is today. And on top of that, we got rid of the carbon tax and we got rid of the mining tax. So we cut taxes, we dealt with savings in the budget, and we call savings on expenditure. The Labor Party calls savings increasing taxes. That's just newspeak.
But if I listen to those words, the only conclusion I can come up to is that debt and deficit must have gone down because you've done so well, but they haven't.
No, because the deficit, there is still a deficit, Graham. As long as there is a deficit, that will add to debt. I mean, that's just maths. And that's why you have to reduce the deficit. Until you're not in deficit, then you will keep adding to debt.
When do we hit surplus, Scott? I mean, it seems to me it's on the never now.
No, we will hit it when expenditure is less than revenue, Graham, as I said today. And that's why we have to focus on getting expenditure down as a share of the economy. And expenditure as a share of the economy is still above the long-run average. Revenue as a share of the economy will actually be higher than the long-run average next year, and it's going to escalate on current estimates if there is no change which is made to personal income tax to around 25.8% of GDP. And that's too much.
And where does Australia need it? 25?
Pardon?
Where does Australia need that line to be? 25? 25.0, I'm saying?
If you look on expenditure, if you look over the last 30 years, there's only 1 year in which we had a surplus where expenditure to GDP as a share of the economy was above 25%, and that was back in 2000, and that was when the GST came into effect, and there was some, there were some aberrations in the numbers at that time. So, I mean, I think these are worthy goals, but when you've got an NDIS coming down the pike and everything else, keeping expenditure to that level, I think will be very, very difficult. Now we get it down to 25.3 currently over the budget and the forward estimates. And keeping it at that level, I think, will prove very, very difficult given the pressures that are on their way with all this other extra spending that has come from the NDIS and other commitments that were made some time ago.
Well, that means big cuts. And big cuts aren't too flash right before an election, are they?
Well, what it means is saying no to new spending. I mean, I just outlined that over the last 2 years, quite worthy spending measures, some 70 billion, more on infrastructure, more going into any number of areas, national security and so on. But what we have to be very mindful of is the ability to say no to higher costs and bearing those extra costs and making sure we keep those costs down. It's as much as dealing with the stuff coming in the front door as the stuff that is already in the house. You've got to deal with both.
Yeah, but as Paul Keating said last week, the world has trimmed our income, so we have to trim our spending. You're talking about holding it, but don't we need to trim it and trim it quite a bit?
Well, this is what we're actually doing. And there's $13 billion of savings, actual savings, right now that are being opposed by the opposition, and if they supported them, they would be realised. So, I mean, they've got $13 billion that they oppose, they've got $14 billion in new spending they announced since May, and there's $30 billion of measures that we actually got passed that they want to reverse if they're elected. So that's some $57 billion that they want to add to the budget bottom line. Now, that's all $57 billion that we've been able to deal with. So we are doing everything that would be expected of the government to get expenditure under control, and we haven't stopped yet. But we understand that this is a test match, not a 2020 match, and we're going to keep focused on the test match innings that is needed.
Well, that having been said, what are we doing with the Googles and the Caltexes and the Shells and the Apples who pay bugger all tax in Australia and make an awful lot of money out of us? What are we doing about them?
Yeah. Three things. First one is we passed multinational anti-avoidance laws through the Parliament last year, which enables the tax office to ensure that the income they earn in this country is taxed as income in this country. We passed that law last year in December, and it was opposed by the Labor Party. Last week I introduced legislation into the Parliament which will see digital services sold online, so things that Google or Facebook or people like that are selling online from overseas, Netflix, all that sort of thing. That will be taxed with the GST, and so we'll tax it at the point of sale. That's something we've done. And we're also now moving to abolish the low value threshold, where there's a process we're going through there which means that goods that are bought from overseas online below that $1,000 threshold will also attract the GST.
Goods below the $1,000 threshold is one thing, but that's not BHP and the big boys, is it? I want to know what we're doing with the big boys.
Well, that's the law we passed in December, Graham. And the number of big boys that you're referring to, before we passed that law that we could go after was 30. After we passed that law, it's now 80, and it includes all those companies you've mentioned. And I can't for the life of me think why the Labor Party wanted to vote against a law that was going to allow us to go after them.
I think they would say if they were here, they would say if they were here, because they wanted it stronger than what you were doing.
No, that's rubbish. That's absolute rubbish.
Well, that's what they're saying. Maybe they're talking rubbish, but that's what they're saying. But I'm just interested. You say that's now 80. How many of them are we actually after? As we speak, there's 80 you can go after. How many are you actually going after?
80 are the ones we're directly involved with right now in the tax office, and you would have seen the tax commissioner make some very strong statements about that in estimates last week.
Yeah, it was very strong.
On multinational tax, we've passed laws, we've introduced new laws, and we're trying to get it at the point of sale or at the point of profit. Now, for 6 years, the previous government did nothing about this. They've discovered multinational tax in opposition. They mustn't have thought multinationals had existed when they were in government. But now they're in opposition, they've got terribly worked up, but then they vote against laws that actually enable us to go after them. I don't get it.
Well, I'm sure you don't, but it's not up to me to defend them. They can defend themselves.
No, I'm not.
I want to turn to this issue. When you started off the interview tonight, you returned to the mantra that you use all the time about jobs and growth. Now, last night on Richo and Jones, we had a very interesting 20 minutes with Dick Smith, who's talking about why do we want this growth anyway, that it's a Ponzi scheme, that in the end it has to collapse, you can't keep going, and he's talking about limiting immigration to 70,000 instead of the 200 odd, I forget the exact figure, 200 odd thousand we have now. What's wrong with that theory of his?
Well, there are many reasons why your economy grows, and population growth is one of them. I mean, one of the reasons why we revised down the projections of growth in the mid-year statement last year is because net overseas migration actually already has reduced. I mean, it's actually much lower today than it was a few years ago. Net overseas migration sort of moves a bit with how the economy is moving globally and here. It's important that your migration program is focused on skills and people who can come and make a contribution to the country. They have an earning capacity. They can actually value add. And that's been the history of Australia's economic success over generations. I mean, we're all migrants unless we're Indigenous. Doesn't matter how far you go back, whether it's the First Fleet for me or whoever else. We're all migrants of one description or another, how many generations removed. So migration's always been part of the mix of our growth, but that migration intake has to be focused on those who can come and add value and make an economic contribution, and that's one of the, I think, one of the great success stories of Australia's immigration.
No, but hang on, over the last few years there are just so many of the new migrants who are on welfare, and are on welfare for a long time. It's just not working. working.
But that's a new phenomenon, is it? I don't think it is, Graham. I think there are some migrant communities, particularly some that came out in the 1980s, who that has been a real problem. And where we've had a problem with some waves of migration and some cohorts, it's been because they've come under programs which weren't linked to skills. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we had to stop the boats. Some 50,000 people had come through the back door under the previous government without that qualification.
But we're not on the boats here. We're talking about 200,000 who come in the front door. That we say, OK, tick, you can come. And it just seems to me that's not working too well.
Sorry. No, well, I don't agree with that. I mean, you've got the family reunion program, and that is something that's been got under a lot more control than it was previously. But the vast bulk of those who are coming under the skills program, where there is an assessment of their ability to come and get a job. And did you know that the unemployment rate amongst those who have come as skilled migrant to this country is actually lower than it is for the rest of the Australian population?
Yeah, I know, but as I said, there's a lot of migrants who are going straight on welfare and staying there. Listen, I'm sorry, I've got to leave it there.
Yeah, particularly those who came on the boats. That's very true.
We'll have to agree to disagree, but that's all right. It's a democracy and you have a right to be wrong. Scott Morrison, can I thank you very much for your time?
Thanks a lot, Graham. Always a pleasure.
Good on you, mate.